Hello and welcome to Dateline London. I'm Jane Hill. This week we are discussing what the world leaders meeting in Germany for the G20 Summit might be able to achieve. We will look at continuing problems on India's border, both with China as well as Pakistan, and also a final thought about an exceptionally busy few months in the UK and abroad. Just how desperate is everyone for a holiday? Before that, though, let's introduce all my guests here today. Ian Martin is with me, columnist with The Times, Ashish Rai of Rai Media, Nabila Ramdani, the French-Algerian journalist, and Henry Chu, the international editor of Variety magazine. A warm welcome to all of you. So the discussions in the German city of Hamburg involving the world's leaders come at a delicate time for the world order. North Korea, climate change, the immigration crisis, Trump in Europe. There is a very, very long list that we could discuss. Let's see how much we can get through. Ian, let's start with you. And President Trump saying, really, in the last few hours, there's going to be a very, very swift trade deal, apparently, with the UK.
Yeah, so it seems. I mean, there's good news for Britain and bad news out of this. That the good news seems to be that there's going to be a trade deal, and the bad news is Donald Trump has confirmed at some point he's coming to the UK, though I am sort of rather...
Depending on one's view, obviously.
Yeah, well, I kind of wonder, Britain's a very divided country at the moment. You wonder whether he might actually do us a service of uniting Britain against such a visit. But I think the big story of the G20 is really the diminution, the weakening of American power. And I'm just reminded, having seen a lot of these sort of summits, and you think back to, I can remember the violence in in Nice, and you think of Genoa, and against this backdrop of chaos and extreme violence, 15 years ago these events were really about American power and the projection of American power and America solving the world's problems. That's now clearly no longer the case, and power has become diffuse. And for all that we focus on Trump for obvious reasons, because he's entertaining, controversial figure, he's not really as powerful necessarily as he thinks, or as a lot of Americans think.
I feel like everyone's nodding around the table. And Nabila, let's start with you.
Well, I do agree very much with what you've just said, Ian, and I think all the massive violence that we're seeing on the streets of Hamburg this weekend is a perfect metaphor, actually, for international diplomacy. And intense passions have been aroused. And the principal responsible, in my opinion, is Donald Trump's position as the alleged leader of the free world. And so this is hardly an environment for constructive policy making. And I think that in the past, summits of this kind used to be all about cohesion and indeed problem solving. And I feel that now they're more about PR and indeed showbiz. You just have to look at the way all these world leaders are marching off to the next meeting, or they're posing for these endless pictures. And I feel that in effect, this testifies to a crisis in confidence and, in fact, the Western consensus, which has been so prevalent for many years. And people talk about post-capitalism, but this is almost post-diplomacy, where commentators are far more concerned about misspeaking and, indeed, that kind of things, rather than anything that has any substance whatsoever.
What, so no one dares say what they really think, or?
No, I think that the idea that you can get any consensus, let alone policy, done at this kind of meetings is frankly absurd. Let's not forget that these leaders can link up at any time nowadays in this great communication era. So the idea that they're going to get anything done, over a very violent, hot and socially awkward meeting is ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree that what comes out of these meetings, these communiques, are often bland to the point of pointless, actually. And, how many of us can remember a communique that has been issued from one of these summits? I don't necessarily think that there's a complete break from the past, in that it's interesting, Ian, you mentioned 15 years ago and protests against American might. Well, then you had actually President George W. Bush, who was talking about, for example, imposing tariffs on steel, which is exactly what's happening today. So there's a little bit of continuity between what happened literally 15 years ago and today. However, I do agree, though, that the isolation that the U.S. is undergoing because of our current leader is not anything that I've witnessed before in my lifetime. It was that usually America was seen as ahead of the curve, or at least trying to lead, and this is America retreating and actually finding itself not just being shunned by powers that we had thought were unfriendly to us, but by those who are friendly. And when you have 1 against 19 in a communique, for example, over climate change, well, that really says something right there.
That is a process that was begun by President Obama, wasn't it? It's the retreat after the disaster of Iraq, the leading from behind view of the world. I'm obviously not associating Obama and Trump. Their approach to world affairs is entirely different. But this is, I think, Trump might be accelerating the process and America's retreat from the world. But Obama took a very different view from Clinton. I'm thinking even longer than 15 years ago, thinking back to the tail end of the Clinton era when there were demonstrations as well, and the early Bush years. Both of those Democrat and Republican leaders saw America in terms of world leadership, which is now looks inherently
ridiculous. But the climate
ridiculous.
change issue that's all driven by Trump. I mean, that is one of his bête noire, isn't it?
Yeah, though it wouldn't have been that different from George Bush's view, really.
Who took us out of Kyoto, right? So, or went and ratified Kyoto. But I think the difference with Obama, though, is I agree that perhaps he didn't seem to project the same kind of persona that we've become accustomed to with U.S. leaders. But his idea of diplomacy or leading was more through multilateralist organizations. And Trump is actually trying to pull himself even away from that and being isolationist.
Well,
and that is something I think we can't afford in this world.
I think it's important to bear in mind that while the policy of withdrawing did begin under Obama, but there's a vast difference. Today we have the first G20 where the United States is not playing a central role, it's playing a peripheral role. And that, I think, is a significant change from the past. And you have 4 big agenda items, I guess, and either the United States is not a part of this or they are being obstructive. Climate change, for instance, international trade, for instance. Now, North Korea has been outsourced to China by President Trump. And you have, of course, the 4th element where I think there could be some consensus, and that's the area of counterterrorism. That's where I think there is more or less a consensus among the G20 countries. Having said that, I think the problem is, of course, in the wording of these documents and the follow-up. There has to be a strong enough wording, which rarely happens at G20 or any of these summits for that matter. The bigger the group, the more difficult to get stronger wording. But then comes the matter of follow-up. We are now, 9 years after the economic meltdown? We are still in austerity. So that tells you how much the action that has followed or the resolutions that have been taken at G20 summits have done or not done.
I would say, however, that beyond the G20 summit itself, there is strong indication that world leaders take bilateral meetings more seriously than general ones. As we've seen this morning, Theresa May met with Donald Trump when they didn't hold hands on this occasion. But we heard pledges from Donald Trump saying there will be very, very big trade deals.
Yes.
The reality, however, is that Theresa May could be gone before proper negotiations start, and so could Trump. And this is an example of how the G20 meeting cannot again come across as, more hot air rather than anything being achieved. And it's all about good pledges, which can turn pretty hollow in the end.
But so are we all saying that actually these big set-piece meetings are worthless now? Should we just not stage them anymore, just have the bilaterals that you talk about?
Well, I think the nature of those meetings have changed, and we have to accept that or take that into account. For example, I'm pretty sure that a lot of people in France and indeed in Europe would have been shocked at the way the French President Emmanuel Macron was palling up with Trump, for example. Of course, you have to be respectful and diplomatic on those occasions, but it's rather different than, literally palling up with somebody like Trump. And I think President Macron will have to learn that international politics is much more complicated than pawing somebody like Trump or treating him like a buddy.
Well, and I think having meetings like this actually does serve a purpose sometimes, because after the financial meltdown, there was a G20 that did focus on how to try to repair the global financial system and came away with some good ideas from that. But right now, I think with the U.S. being so isolated, but historically having been the leader and no longer, I think there's a real deficit there.
Ian, a thought from you as well about Theresa May and how she has performed here. Nabila mentioned the meeting with Trump. She goes into this at a very, very curious and difficult time in this country. What's your take on how she's performed here?
Yeah, I think the way to understand it really is to think of her as a leader who's being propped up by her cabinet because they can't necessarily agree on a replacement. So she's, it sounds cruel, but almost a cardboard cutout Prime Minister. And this month, the focus really is on, can she make it through the summer, through to Conservative Party conference, which is in October, or will she go by Christmas? Or who is the leader? Do the Conservatives skip a next generation and go for someone younger, which is difficult because it might not be someone untried and untested. So she's really there. She's there as a sort of placeholder Prime Minister. And I think the thing that is most difficult, where that really complicates Brexit, is that very often, and this is where I think diplomacy does still matter, about the connection between leaders, that leaders can sometimes bridge the divide. If the talks get bogged down on Brexit, you would need a strong British Prime Minister to say to Angela Merkel and to Macron, look, there's a gap here, there's a compromise to be done which can make Brexit happen a bit more smoothly than might otherwise be the case. And that requires a Prime Minister with a bit of confidence and some clout and some authority, which I think it's fair to say that Theresa May doesn't have now. So I think it's problematic for the British in terms of how the negotiations go.
Also, looking at it from the other side, Donald Trump saying things like a trade deal will happen quickly doesn't mean anything. He doesn't even know what he's talking about. And I'm very sorry to say this, but I mean, these deals do not happen quickly. They take a very, very long time. So, I mean, you're completely misleading people by saying that.
As is the EU this week, which trumpeted this great trade deal between the EU and Japan, which doesn't actually exist yet, and it's probably going to take 4 or 5 years. So, I mean,
at least.
Yes. Yes.
A quick thought, Ashish, as well about another thought about climate change, though. Is it going to go Angela Merkel's way, do you think?
Well, this is the difficult one. You know, a major player, the world's biggest polluter, is not part of the Paris deal anymore. So how does the world proceed with this deal? Of course, the rest of the world may continue to do what they've committed to do. But without the United States, I think it's a difficult one to achieve the targets that were set at Paris.
Yes.
Yeah. The only consolation that I take from this is that in the U.S. you have states, for example, my home state of California, which are still committed to trying to reduce carbon emissions and have a much more environmental sense, and the idea that climate change is real and is happening and needs to be countered as much as possible. So although it may not be happening on the federal level from the White House, there at least are movements and states that are trying to take action on this.
But that's so interesting, isn't it? But also it is one of those issues that if big polluting industrialised countries are not united, though, I think to your point, Ashish, people will say, well, what's the point? It's no good being as green as you can be in California, despite its size and its economic power, if everybody's not on board with this.
Yeah. And as long as we see that whether China and India actually live up to their commitments too, right? I mean, it's good that they're pledging to, but China has had a history of economic environmental degradation, even though they have policies that are supposed to alleviate that. And so, I mean, hopefully they will live up to their commitments.
We will be discussing that all again, I am quite sure. Well, of course, Narendra Modi is one of the many leaders at the G20 Summit in Hamburg. And let's talk to Ashish about many of the problems confronting him at the moment. And in terms of what's coming out of Hamburg, what do we know about any meeting between Modi and President Xi? Because that is where some of the key tensions are, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. At the moment, the standoff between India and China on the border, which is a disputed border. Of course, the two sides have different viewpoints on what the border, the delineation should be. But yesterday there was a 5-minute chat between the two leaders, President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, at Hamburg. And the outcome, of course, is not known because neither side has confirmed whether the standoff was discussed at all. There has been a lot of tension of late. China had refused the meeting to start with because they said the atmosphere is not right for such a meeting. But eventually what happened was there was a meeting of BRICS leaders, and there was a pull aside, as they call it, at that meeting, and the two did have a chat for about 5 minutes. That said, I think China has been playing very tough in recent times, and the China-Pakistan axis really endangers India at the moment. Of late, this is a bit unusual because in the last 25 years or so, since the Peace and Tranquility Treaty between India and China, things have been going very well. Indeed, on the trade front, they've been going extremely well, particularly for China. But all of a sudden, in the last 3 years, the Chinese approach has become very tough. And there is, of course, reason for this. But at the same time, I think there is a collision which needs to be sorted out between these two major Asian countries.
Henry, you're nodding, is it?
Well, I'm glad that there was this 5-minute talk, if that's what it was. But what concerns me more is that India and Pakistan are not talking. And that border I find much hotter, obviously, than the India-China border. And given what's been going on in Kashmir, that which is at the very, very heart of their conflict, and the fact that both are nuclear-armed states, Pakistan having just done a test fire of a nuclear missile, I think, earlier this week, that seems much more concerning to me right now than Pakistan-China. I don't know if that's...
Well, I think in general, the tension between India and Pakistan is always at a higher level than the tension between India and China. As a matter of fact, between India and China, matters had cooled off considerably for a number of years, for nearly a quarter of a century. But between India and Pakistan, there's inevitably a face-off. And the Kashmir situation is very hot at the moment, and there is, as you very rightly said, no dialogue between the two countries at ministerial level. Maybe the officials will get together at the civil service level soon. Ambassadors exist in both countries, or rather high commissioners in this case. But fundamentally, it is a very, very tense situation between the two countries.
But isn't this, what's at stake here is that this is, it seems to be potentially the defining relationship of the first half of the 21st century, really, India versus China. And Edward Luce's new book, I think it's called The Retreat of Western Liberalism, makes precisely that point, which is that two models are being tested alongside each other, both newly capitalist, but one autocratic and one democratic. And whoever wins that battle, as American power declines and the West suffers an identity crisis, will become the great power of the future.
That is indeed true. And China has certainly been off to a much faster pace in the last 30 years or so, whereas democratic India has had challenges. At the moment, the situation is very interesting because China has slowed down, and so has India. And this is basically part of this meltdown catching up, or not quite allowing the two countries to take off as they would have liked to do. But there was a time that India was growing at 10% plus GDP. So that was remarkable for a country which is democratic, where you have hurdles, you've got court cases to deal with before you can even start a project like a motorway. So in that situation, India was doing quite well. But inevitably, I think the pace is faster in China. Ultimately, India might get there, but it's a very interesting two models competing with each other.
Yes. Yes, Nabila.
Yeah, I do also think, like you, Ian, that it seems to me that China's encroachment on that small disputed territory, which is at the intersection of India, China and Bhutan, which is my understanding is the dispute is all about.
Yes.
It seems to me that it's all about the budding superpower, China trying to expand its sphere of influence beyond East Asia and to South Asia. This time around, not in an armed conflict, but it seems to me that it's all about, it amounts in effect to a geostrategic Cold War with India. And it's not the first time that the two countries have had a standoff. There was one, of course, going back to 1962. It was an armed one at the time, and it involved tensions over Tibet and along the border. And China had emerged victorious. But this is the longest standoff so far between the two countries.
Yeah, we've been talking about America's retreat, if we see it that way, going in on itself in relation to G20. But does America have a role to play here and in relation to China?
Between China and India, I'm not so sure, actually. But what is been commented on a lot, and what I find ironic, having lived in China and also being American, is seeing the ascendancy of China politically and now extending its sphere of influence into places that the U.S. had previously occupied. And so whether it's on climate or also the projection of power it's trying to do through naval forces, for example, in the shipping lanes around Asia, that had historically been the U.S. that protected those shipping lanes. And I find it rather worrisome, actually, that now China is stepping into the breach. But that's another sign of America retreating from what had been its historic duties. I don't know if that's too strong a word, but at least the role that it had played.
I also, while I'm concerned about the decline of America diplomatically, I also wouldn't write off the US. I mean, even though it's been through all this economic turmoil, it has still, in the last 25, 30 years, been by far the most innovative economy on earth. And there's something, someone a believer in democracy, there's something inherently necessary for innovation, competition to happen. You have to have a free society. And I think that's the problem, the unknowable thing with China is really, can you, in an autocratic society, can you innovate? You can certainly replicate and become very efficient and very, very successful, but can you produce the answer to climate change, the next wave of the internet, all the stuff that has come out of America in the last 25 or 30 years has its roots in Bill Gates being rebellious and a battle of ideas and saying, I'm not going to go off and join the state-run company and take other people's orders. I'm going to go off and innovate and invent because my ideas are better than the other guy's ideas. That thing runs right through American society, and I think, even though America is in a bad place, shouldn't be written off.
I would just add, if I may, that withdrawing from expensive wars will lead to an economic bounce back for the United States. Whether it happens under the Trump model, we don't know. But certainly, I think there was an indication that coming out of these very expensive situations in the Middle East and Afghanistan was helpful, and gradually it would lead to prosperity. But that said, there was a strategic agreement between the United States and India, which China saw as being against China. This was an agreement between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi. But that seems to have slipped away under President Trump.
But I think this is also to do with an arms race, and I think Modi's visit to Israel testifies to that. It's, to me, it's another example of a populist global leader who's trying to humiliate millions of Muslims around the world, not only in his own country, but also in neighbouring Pakistan. And he wants to portray them as the enemy within, but also one that threatens externally. And instead of conciliation and indeed resorting to democracy, he sees the future in a constant armed struggle, with his side being armed to the teeth and ready to dispatch as many Muslims as possible when trouble arises. And this, I would call it the Israeli model, and this is why Modi has chosen to actually break decades of overt Indian support for the Palestinian cause, and indeed decided to pally up effectively with a notorious far-right hawk like Benjamin Netanyahu. And his behavior in Israel included snubbing grabbing Palestinian leaders, not least of all Mahmoud Abbas, but also stocking up with weapons. And frankly, I found it quite outrageous that a leader like Modi chooses to side with the state of Israel, which which regularly breaches international and humanitarian laws, and whose leaders, past and present, stand accused of war crimes, and who constantly expand its illegal colonial entity. I found this quite distasteful.
Well, those are some of the very, very big questions that we will continue to debate. It is July, though. Let's just take a very brief moment, because every journalist I know in the UK and abroad, I think, is completely worn out after events of the last few weeks. The Queen is on holiday. Westminster is about to shut down. Let's find out what our guests are planning. And now that we are in July, Ian, every political correspondent I know is on their knees. Where are you off to?
I think,
I assume you are.
The south of France as quickly as possible in about 3 or 4 days' time. But yeah, I've never known a period where people are just so much in need of holiday. And on Brexit business, Trump, Britain's been on this cycle through the Scottish referendum. Yes. This has been running for 3-4 years of intense activity. And I think combined with the heat, the political and media establishment in London at the moment has gone completely off its head and needs to go away for a while.
Yeah. You're all in agreement. Nabila, quick thought.
Well, I think journalists clearly have a difficulty nowadays switching off completely now that the news cycle is 24 hours a day and we're all getting sucked into all of this at any time of the year, frankly. And I remember a time when I would go on holiday and come back, catching up with the world by watching the TV news bulletin or reading the newspaper. But now TV screens are absolutely everywhere.
Oh, yes.
And you're also encouraged to be connected to your devices at all times.
Don't do it. Switch them off, Ashish.
Well, to me, this is the most enjoyable time of the year, because I go to Lord's to watch Test cricket. I go to Wimbledon to watch tennis.
Wonderful.
And there's the British Open golf coming up. So I'm really looking forward to it.
And it's nearly the proms. Let's get that one in as well, Henry.
Well, I figure with Brexit looming that I should go to countries that right now I don't need a visa to go visit. So I've picked Scotland. And we'll be visiting the Highlands, which I've never done before. So really looking forward to that.
Oh, you will love it.
Yeah.
You will love it. Well, enjoy, all of you. Very well deserved, I'm quite sure. Switch off that iPhone, Nabila. And for anyone watching who is going on holiday, have a wonderful time. Those of us who are not going on holiday, we'll see you all again over the course of the summer. For now, from all of us, enjoy your week. Thanks for being with us. See you again. Bye-bye.